Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to tell you about our experience of introducing continuous processing, particularly of solid dose manufacture in the pharmaceutical industry. You can read a full article on this topic that we can't possibly cover in the time we've allocated to us this afternoon, which was published in the March-April edition of Biopharma Asia. You can find various definitions for continuous processing. The main point is that the process is able to run continuously and without interruption, unlike traditional batch processes that we see more than often today. And the second point is that some sort of computer control is required to manage the process. Now, continuous processing is not a new concept. Other industries outside the pharmaceutical industry, such as chemicals and food, for example, have been using the continuous mode to enable large volume production in a cost-effective way for many years. There's a couple of examples on the slide. The pharmaceutical industry, however, has been slower and much slower off the mark to introduce continuous processing. And there are various reasons for this, but there are, in fact, potential benefits, and there are strong drivers now, and there's a growing interest for introducing it in the future. So some of the benefits of introducing continuous processing in the pharmaceutical industry are listed on this slide. It's extremely attractive to do this. Overall, continuous processing is considered to be an intrinsically more efficient approach compared to batch processing, and there's evidence that it should produce a more consistent product quality. One key advantage in an R&D environment is that scaling up from laboratory scale to commercial scale can be achieved by running the process for a longer period of time. This avoids the need to consider changes of equipment geometry and design when scaling up, and therefore could speed up the development time. It also avoids the need to have a range of process trains that operate at different scales. So this obviously reduces the pilot plant footprint and the associated equipment and inventory costs. Continuous processing provides a really good opportunity for rapid product development and manufacture, and it's possible to apply all the quality by design approaches that use process analytical technologies, or PAT, for advanced process control and data gathering. The increasing availability and reliability of inline PAT and process control mechanisms are critical for the success of continuous processing in the pharma industry to address both quality and cost concerns. For example, to avoid the need to reject an entire manufacturing campaign because it was not possible to segregate good from bad products in the same campaign. And looking at this optimistically, there is a real potential for achieving real-time release with continuous processes and reduced analytical testing and the costs associated with that. However, there are some perceived and real barriers to adopting continuous processing. Most pharmaceutical companies, like ourselves at AstraZeneca, have a surplus of traditional batch manufacturing assets. So introducing continuous processes can create an investment hurdle to get over. Purchasing new continuous processing equipment has to demonstrate a quick return on investment, or a company would rapidly lose interest in it. Traditional batch manufacturing is deeply embedded in the pharma industry, and there needs to be a culture change to accept new ways of working. There are also perceived regulatory concerns, largely due to a lack of experience and a fear of the unknown. But there are actually no current regulations or guidance that prohibits the implementation of continuous processing. In fact, the US FDA have actually been promoting the idea to improve quality and also to fit in with the new incentives for the future. But there is a concern that other regulatory agencies have different attitudes to the FDA, and they may be slower to adopt this way of working. So there is quite a challenge to win the hearts and minds of all the players involved.
So what Mark has described to you, this is now Marcel speaking, and what Mark's described to you is the drivers and demands for the use of continuous processing, but also some of the areas and some of the issues which may prohibit or prevent or reduce the rate of uptake of such technology. So if we consider continuous processing technology to be relatively new, clearly we've been using batch processes for many years, and really it's a relatively new theme for the pharmaceutical industry. We can see we're probably at the beginning of the innovation adoption life cycle for such technology. Now, there are a group of companies who have probably shown greater interest over the last 10 years in the use of continuous processes, not for the manufacture of drug substances, but for drug products. And there's a handful of key players in that area, and AstraZeneca being one of them. But what we'll see is, in reality, you could consider us to be early adopters for this type of technology. There are probably an even smaller number of companies who have really been critical to the development and invention of the technology and its implementation. But I would say AstraZeneca and a number of other companies who I'll talk about on some subsequent slides are really in at that early adopter stage. And what you would expect is, as with everything else, as the technology starts to develop, it starts to be implemented on development projects, and we start to see some commercial products reach the market using this technology, you would anticipate an increased number of companies start to make investments in this area. So we're still a relatively early stage for a technology of this nature. But if we think about the journey so far, where have we gotten to? Clearly, Mark mentioned that continuous processing in itself is not particularly a new concept. If you think about the fast-moving consumer goods industry, foods, even chemical manufacture, they've been using continuous processing for some time, and primarily using it from the purpose of cost-effective manufacture, where we're dealing with very, very high-volume products with massive rates of throughput, which is clearly very different to what you would anticipate to see in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, there are some changing trends in the pharma industry with a move to more what you might call niche products and stratified products, which are targeted towards segments of the population who are most likely to respond, and often those products will come along with things like companion diagnostics. But you would anticipate the volumes of manufacture for these products being relatively small. But we believe that continuous processing will offer an advantage even for these small volume products, and will allow us to manufacture them very quickly and in a very flexible way, so we can move in between products quite quickly and move between scales as and when demand requires it. So you're moving towards a more agile and demand-driven supply chain than the current supply chain which exists, where we've got larger inventories, and in some companies those large inventories can equate to billions of dollars worth of products, and clearly in an environment where actually cost-effective manufacture is increasingly important, you can't afford to be having those inventories sat there without somebody reimbursing you for those products. But clearly there are also, even though this is a direction in which we wish to go, there are some challenges and hurdles, as Mark articulated well, which may prevent us from going there. Some of this is around the regulatory side of things, and even though there are no real blockers, there are some perceived blockers and some issues which might make the path a little bit more tortuous. But clearly some technical challenges as well, and we're using technologies which we don't fully understand, and we need to start to build that level of understanding. And this is where we need to go, and clearly we're running on a continuous line. It would be useful to be able to monitor your process during that time, ensuring that your process continually produces material of the requisite quality, whether you're running for several hours or 24/7. We need to have that assurance, and therefore building in things like novel process sensors and advanced control systems is quite critical. Now, there are several examples out there where companies are already doing this, where they have continuous processes in processing equipment in commercial plants. So I think Pfizer have presented some examples of where they have dry processing units, and I think in 3 plants that are dispersed over China and the US. GSK also have a commercial plant available for the manufacture of oral solid dosage forms using continuous processing technology. And clearly, you've seen things like the large investments that Novartis are making in particular their interactions with Massachusetts Institute of Technology to try and take their capability in continuous processing forward. So clearly there's a great understanding, there's an ambition and an appetite to do it, and people are moving with that. And in doing that, what you would hope is they'll start to overcome and address some of the tech issues, and not necessarily do that in isolation, but do that by working with other groups, other industry players, but also some of the key and leading academic groups who are out there spread across the globe. And one point at the bottom of the slide is that one of the other drivers is clearly cost, and I think in the past, cost was something you could deal with by simply going to a low-cost provider in a low-cost nation. I think as we move forward and markets such as China start to emerge and become more prosperous, you find that the cost benefits, which were there 10 years ago, will no longer be there. So this is something we need to deal with, and it becomes very important. So there's an interest. People have started to build and develop the technology, and here's an example on this slide of a technology, a commercially available platform being having been developed by GEA in Belgium, which is being made available to quite a number of key pharmaceutical players. So this is an example of a 25 kilogram per hour machine. So it's a continuous line from powder through to tablets with a coater being developed. And what they've tried to do is build this into potentially into a modular platform where you can move between wet granulation and direct compression and dry granulation in the form of rolled compaction. So this is something which could be applicable to a number of companies for the development of continuous processes. So I won't go into much detail about the technology, only to say that for the wet granulation technology, they achieved that by effectively using a modified piece of extrusion equipment. So you'll see on the bottom of the slide the screws from a twin screw granulation system, which have been effectively adapted so that you're able to granulate using this type of technology. And in order to maintain that continuous train, it's developed alongside a 6-segment fluid bed dryer. So effectively, as material comes off the granulator unit, off the extruder unit, it goes into one segment of the fluid bed dryer, starts to dry, that segment passes round in a carousel type unit, and the next aliquot goes into another segment, and so on. And that allows you to work in a kind of semi-continuous stroke continuous fashion. So clearly, lots of interest and appetite. There are commercial platforms available which allow people to go and develop dosage forms and bring them to the market. And there are also a number of players out there are helping to build a better mechanistic insights and a better fundamental understanding of continuous processes and develop the requisite technologies so that we can develop robust processes. And some of these we are currently interacting with and collaborating with, and some not. But nonetheless, there are lists which I won't go through of key players across the US and Europe who are involved in this area. So just to summarise the journey so far, AstraZeneca and many other companies will have had an initial interest in continuous processing over the last decade or so. So our interest dates back to probably the early 2000s, where we started to work with the likes of GEA to look at some of the kind of prototype equipment they were starting to evaluate. What that has subsequently transformed into is investment in development scale equipment to allow us to start evaluating the use of this technology, but also building it into development projects. And that is a substantial stride we've made subsequently. And we're doing this in parallel with working with academic groups, key academic groups, to start building our fundamental understanding of these types of technologies. Where we effectively need to go next, if we wish to commercialize products, is to a point where we have this capability available in an operations environment, so we can transfer our commercial products into operations. And then clearly, this is something we then need to make sure we're adopting for all of our products where necessary. So along the way of starting to implement continuous processing, we've clearly gathered a number of learning points. One of these learning points is that we need to have a quite clear strategy and direction for implementing continuous processing. You cannot do this in isolation. You need to have a long-term view about this, because if you start to do it in development, clearly your operations colleagues need to plan and ensure that they have the capability and assets in-house to deal with it. Now that's quite a difficult situation, particularly as Mark mentioned, where you've already got an existing asset base which works perfectly well. Why would you move towards continuous process? And you need to work with these key stakeholders to make that business case clear and make this sort of technical justification clear and start that implementation process. And you can't do it by just jumping full throttle into the adoption of continuous processes. You have to dip your toe in the water to an extent and start to evaluate it, pilot projects, start to generate some of that mechanistic and fundamental understanding, which gives you an understanding of where you would apply this type of technology. And then we can start to apply that learning to projects as quickly as possible. Clearly what we have to do, we can't do this in isolation. If we want to push it forward, the technology needs to become almost an industry standard, and to do that we need to work with others to make sure that becomes the case. But clearly there's also an influencing role around groups such as health agencies, health authorities, to make sure they have an understanding of when and where we apply them, and they buy into the use of this, what effectively is a reasonably new technology. So there's quite an influencing piece to do, and it has to be done in collaboration with others. But most of all, if we want to do this successfully, we have to do it by identifying individuals within our organisation who are passionate and enthusiastic for this type of technology, because you will come across quite substantial resistance within your organisations. People, for whatever reason, who've been doing it one way for a number of years, can see the hurdles and pitfalls, but can't always see the benefits. So it takes somebody to really champion this and drive it within your organisation, and that person has to be very passionate. So on that note, I'll conclude very quickly, but only to say that we've made substantial momentum within AstraZeneca already, and you'll find in companies like GSK and Pfizer and others, and Janssen and Novartis, probably made more progress than ourselves. So there is substantial momentum being generated, and in order to get to a point where continuous processing becomes the norm, we have to construct that wall, and there are a number of bricks in that wall which we need to deal with. And I won't go all of these now, but clearly we need to build a capability. Clearly we need to build that capability and have that investment at a time when we have existing assets which are not being used to full capacity. Most of all, really, and somebody who's used the terminology in the past, it's around hearts and minds. We have to convince individuals within an organisation who have used certain types of technology forever and a day to start using new technology which has better functionality, which has the potential for us to develop more robust products and to do that more cost effectively. And that's not a simple process. So really it's around collaboration, it's around innovation, but it's around building the right culture. And on that note, this is where we conclude. So thank you very much for listening. We're happy to take any questions. Yeah. So I hope people can hear us. Because we unfortunately can't hear Carrie or anybody else online. But we just received a question, which was, can you talk about PAT software suppliers and any challenges and successes? In reality, I think where we are in terms of our implementation of continuous processing is we're still at quite an early stage where we're starting to evaluate some of the potential sensors we could use to tell us and give us some knowledge about the process. And some of those are around measuring various characteristics of the materials either in process or at the end of the process, towards the end of the process. Now, what we've not got to a stage of yet is being absolutely clear on the control systems and the software we would use. So I know people out there will talk about things like SidePath and other things from Siemens and others. We've not really got to that stage of evaluating in detail where we would go versus the systems we're currently using. So I'm afraid we can't give you a definitive answer on which software to use. But in reality, I think we will make those decisions nearer to the time as we get closer to the use of this technology for commercialised products. And we have a group within AstraZeneca who will be involved in making those decisions and probably have their eye on some specific softwares which are commonly used at this moment.